It started, as most betrayals do, with something mundane. It was a Tuesday evening, a week before my daughter, Lily, was due for her follow-up appointment. I was at my parents' house, retrieving a box of old photo albums for a school project, the kind of trivial errand that, in retrospect, served as a catastrophic, self-detonating mechanism for my entire family history. My father, Robert, was meticulous to a fault. He had a small mahogany writing desk in the den where he kept his finances, always locked, always organized. The key to the desk, however, was not on his heavy brass keyring, but tucked into an old leather-bound copy of A Tale of Two Cities on the second shelf of the built-in bookcase. I'd known this since I was 10, when I was hunting for loose change. I didn't intend to snoop. The photo albums were in a storage closet right next to the desk. But as I pulled the heavy cardboard box from the shelf, a manila envelope slid out from beneath it and fluttered to the beige carpet. It wasn't sealed, and the corner had dog-eared from the friction. Curiosity, that ancient insidious sin, nudged me. I picked it up. Inside were property documents. Not standard, dusty old deeds, but a glossy, freshly minted grant deed from the county recorder's office. My hands started to tremble before my mind had time to catch up. The name of the grantee was Mark R. Hayes. That was my brother. The property address was a newly constructed townhouse development on the affluent west side of town, the same development where Mark and his wife, Clara, had been talking about buying a place for over a year, something they supposedly couldn't afford. The purchase price listed on the deed's transfer tax affidavit was staggering, $850,000, but it was the bottom of the page that made the blood roar in my ears. The grantor was listed as Eleanor D. Hayes and Robert A. Hayes, my mother and father. They hadn't co-signed. They hadn't loaned him the down payment. They had purchased the entire property outright and signed it over to him. It wasn't a gift. It was a quiet, untraceable transfer of almost $1 million in assets handed to their favored son, Mark. I stood there, holding the documents, the polished wood desk glaring back at me. I could hear the faint, cheerful sound of my mother in the kitchen, preparing tomorrow's dinner. The normalcy of it was a physical blow. They had done this in silence, in secret, behind my back, hiding it like something shameful, or maybe hiding it because they knew I would recognize the shame immediately. I carefully slipped the deed back into the envelope, replaced the envelope under the albums, and left the den. I didn't say goodbye to my mother. I couldn't trust the look in my eyes. The adrenaline and the hot spike of betrayal were already beginning to curdle into something far colder and more dangerous. Absolute clarity. The discovery of the house purchase was a shock, but it was not the wound itself. It was merely the surgical evidence of a deep, festering infection that had been left untreated for 2 years. 2 years ago, my daughter, Lily, who had been with Maria and me since she was 6 months old, needed a complicated orthopedic surgery. A congenital condition. It wasn't life-threatening, but it required an expensive, specialized procedure that would correct her gait and prevent debilitating problems by the time she was a teenager. Our insurance covered most of it, but there was a shortfall, a final, insurmountable gap of $160,000 for the surgeon's fee and post-operative physical therapy. Maria and I liquidated our small retirement account. We borrowed from friends. We even started a quiet private GoFundMe. But we were still $40,000 short with 2 weeks to go before the scheduled operation. It was humiliating, but I went to my parents. They were comfortable. Dad had retired early from a successful accounting firm, and their net worth was well into the 7 figures. I remember that day with the horrifying precision of a near-death experience. We were in their sunroom, the afternoon light too bright, too cheerful for the conversation we were having. I laid out the financials, the urgency of Lily's needs, the sheer terror Maria and I felt. My mother, Eleanor, listened with a pursed, sympathetic expression that didn't reach her eyes. My father, Robert, leaned back in his leather chair, steeple-fingered. "We wish we could, David," my mother finally said, her voice dripping with practiced regret. "But you know we can't just dip into our savings like that. We're very risk-averse." "It's not an investment, Mom," I said, my voice tight. "It's a loan. We'll pay you back. We just need a bridge." "It's Lily. She needs this." My father sighed, a deep performative noise of parental suffering. "You have to consider your brother, David. We have to be fair. We have obligations to both our sons." It was a lie, even then. Mark had never needed money. He needed toys. I pushed back, my desperation overriding my pride. Dad, this is a health crisis. This is a medical necessity. Mark just bought a new boat. He's fine. And that's when Robert leaned forward, dropping the compassionate facade like a broken mask. He lowered his voice, making the words sound less like a condemnation and more like an unpleasant, immutable truth. Look, David, he said, using my birth name, the formal address adding a sickening weight to his words. Lily's a wonderful little girl, but we have to prioritize. She's adopted, not fully family, son. If we're being honest, your mother and I simply don't have the same financial obligation there. The air left my lungs. The sunroom went black and silent, the noise of the summer cicadas outside suddenly deafening. Not fully family. My mother, Eleanor, nodded once firmly, crossing her hands over her lap. He's right, David. If we're being honest, she added, her own contribution designed not to soften the blow, but to solidify it with her stamp of approval. I didn't argue. I couldn't. The words had taken the fight out of me, leaving me paralyzed by a pure agonizing coldness. They weren't just refusing money. They were surgically removing my daughter and, by extension, my family, from their legacy, their hearts, and their definition of kinship. I left, stammering some half-hearted agreement that I understood. I didn't get the money from them. We ended up taking a second mortgage on our house, straining our finances to the breaking point. But Lily got her surgery, and it was successful. For 2 years, the wound healed, but only superficially. Underneath, a deep septic scar had formed. I never forgot the look on their faces, the cold, clinical assessment that my little girl was a financial liability not covered by their love. While Mark, their biological son, was an asset worthy of $1 million investment. And now I had the proof, the signed deed, the date on which they bought Mark a house for $850,000. It was dated exactly 3 months after they told me they couldn't afford $40,000 to save their granddaughter, his mobility. In the 2 years since Lily's surgery, my relationship with my parents became a performance. I called on birthdays, showed up for Christmas, and endured the mandatory Sunday dinner once a month. But my voice was monotone, my smiles were mechanical, and I never brought Lily to their house unsupervised. Maria understood. She had seen the raw, broken man who came home that day, and she knew the silence was not passive acceptance, but the quiet grinding of a gear, preparing for a single, final rotation. The discovery of the deed, 6 months ago, changed the performance from a tragedy into a countdown. I knew I couldn't just throw the deed on the table and yell. That would give them the satisfaction of drama, of righteous defense, of calling me the aggressor who tore the family apart. They would play the victim, and Mark would believe them. No, this needed surgical precision. It needed to be done in a way that, even in their old age, they would never forget the truth of what they had done and why I was leaving. The final dinner was set for last night. It was an ordinary Thursday. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and the same pale, watery gravy my mother had made for 40 years. I arrived precisely on time. My brother Mark and his wife Clara were already there, seated at the large oak table. Mark was recounting a story about a particularly frustrating day at the golf course, the kind of trivial complaint that takes up 90% of family conversations. I sat down opposite my mother, and next to Clara. The table was dressed in the usual linen placemats. Everything looked right, smelled right, felt wrong. The tension was entirely internal, a high-pitched, silent frequency only I could hear. Throughout the appetizers, a platter of store-bought cheese and crackers, I was an exemplary son. I asked Mark about his golf swing. I complimented my mother's new blouse. I even asked my father about the stock market, nodding earnestly as he pontificated on the latest fluctuations. I was building a cage of normalcy around them, one polite conversational thread at a time. But every time I looked at my father, I didn't see the man who taught me to ride a bike. I saw the man who calculated the monetary value of his granddaughter's existence and found it lacking. Every time my mother smiled, I remembered her swift, cold endorsement. If we're being honest, the roast chicken was placed on the table. The steam rolled past my face, smelling heavy and familiar, but I felt nothing but a deep, unshakable nausea. Mark was serving the mashed potatoes. "So, Dad," he said casually, "did you ever hear back from the HOA about that landscaping issue over on Redwood Court? Clara mentioned some of the neighbors were complaining." My internal alarm bells screamed. Redwood Court. the street of the house they bought him. My father stiffened slightly, glancing nervously at me. He cleared his throat. Oh, no. No, Mark, I haven't. And that's really not my business, is it? He gave a short fake laugh. Mark looked confused. But you said you'd call Mr. Henderson. Mark, my mother cut in, a sudden sharp edge in her voice. Pass David the gravy, dear. The cover-up, clumsy and immediate, was all the confirmation I needed. My brother was so accustomed to his father solving his property problems that he had forgotten the necessity of the secret. I took the gravy boat from Mark, my fingers brushing his. He was oblivious, already moving on to complain about the heat in his car. The moment was upon me. I put the gravy boat down with a deliberate, quiet clink that felt deafening in the suddenly hushed room. Everyone looked at me. I looked directly at my father. He was already looking away, fiddling with his napkin. It's a beautiful house, Mark, I said, my voice measured and calm, almost conversational. My brother stopped chewing, his eyes widening slightly. What is? The one on Redwood Court, number 4118. The one Mom and Dad bought for you. The silence that followed was a living thing, thick, hostile, and utterly complete. Mark's mouth hung open, a piece of chicken suspended on his fork. Clara's head snapped toward my parents. My mother's face, usually pale, flushed a shocking deep red. My father, Robert, finally looked up at me, and his eyes were not angry yet, just panicked, like a deer caught in headlights. David, I don't know what you're talking about, my father started, his voice a defensive, gravelly rasp. Mark and Clara bought their own home. You know that. They told me they were struggling to get approval, I agreed, still speaking in that terrible flat tone. But the bank approval doesn't matter when you pay in cash, does it? Or rather, when your parents sign the grant deed over to you. I reached into the inner pocket of my sports coat and pulled out a single, neatly folded sheet of paper, a notarized copy of the grant deed, which I'd made sure to print on thick, official-looking paper. I slid it across the table, past the salt shaker, directly in front of my father. He didn't touch it. He just stared at the document and the color drained from his face entirely. I found the original 6 months ago. Dad, $850,000, closed 3 months after you told me you were too financially strapped to loan me $40,000 for Lily's surgery. Mark finally found his voice, a squeak of genuine confusion and betrayal. Dad, what is he talking about? You said you just helped with the closing costs. Mark, shut up. My father snapped, not at me, but at his favorite son. It was the first time I'd ever seen him truly lose control. He took a deep, shuddering breath and turned his attention back to me, trying to regain the dominant position. This is an invasion of privacy, David, Robert said, his voice lowering to a furious, shaking hiss. This is private family business. You have no right. Private. I gave a short, humorless laugh. The necessity of my daughter walking without pain was private. This? I tapped the paper. This is the proof of the cost of your love and the cost of your judgment. My mother, Eleanor, finally intervened, her voice the familiar, sanctimonious whine of the perpetual martyr. David, your father and I are trying to support your brother. Mark and Clara were making responsible decisions. You and Maria have always been irresponsible with money. Adopting a child you couldn't afford, I cut her off, my composure finally beginning to fracture, but my words remained terrifyingly precise. Ford. We afforded $160,000 for her surgery, Mom. We did it by selling half our future, not by going on a quiet shopping trip for a new house. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. You bought Mark a house for $850,000. That is not responsibility. That is favoritism so blatant, so destructive, it borders on the criminal. And what do you want, David? My father challenged, his face now a mask of hard anger, replacing the panic. Do you want money? Is that why you've brought this document? To extort us? To threaten us? The question was the final spike. It implied that my entire existence in their lives for the last 2 years was predicated on a financial motive, that I was no better than a common thief. They truly couldn't see the depth of the emotional and moral chasm they had dug. I sat back, shaking my head slowly, the last vestiges of my hope for reconciliation finally dying. No, Dad, I don't want the money, I said, my voice now dropping to a dangerously low register. I'm not here for the money or for the house. You can give Mark another house next week for all I care. I'm here for the truth. I let my gaze sweep over each of them. Mark, staring at the deed copy, his face a mixture of shock and dawning guilt. Clara, horrified and silent. My mother, defensive and trembling. And my father, white-knuckling the edge of the table. 2 years ago, I came to you desperate. I was begging to save my daughter from a lifetime of physical pain. You had the money sitting in an account, waiting for a property closing date. And your answer was a calculation. $40,000 for Lily was too high a price. $850,000 for Mark's convenience was fine. My father started to speak, to deny, to rationalize, to deflect, but I raised my hand, silencing him instantly. I'd been planning this moment for 6 months. No one was going to interrupt the final word. But the worst part wasn't the money. The worst part was the reasoning. You didn't just refuse a loan. You redefined the core of my family. You looked me in the eye, Robert, and you told me, she's adopted. Not fully family, son. And you, Eleanor, you endorsed it. If we're being honest, I paused, letting the silence expand and fill the room with the toxic air of their past cruelty. I took that sentence home with me. I held it close every night while Maria and I cried over the numbers. I held it when Lily was wheeled into the operating room. I held it when I watched her take her first tentative, straight steps after the surgery. I smiled then, a small, cold curve of the mouth that didn't reach my eyes. And tonight, after 6 months of preparation, after weighing every single memory, every single interaction, every moment of your favoritism against that one sentence, I have the final reply, the one that answers you. I looked them all in the eye, individually, ensuring they would each carry the memory of this moment. My voice was no longer flat. It was layered with the full weight of my love for Lily, my heartbreak over their betrayal, and the steel of my resolve. I delivered the words that shattered the family forever. The debt of $40,000? I repaid that to the bank. The debt of being a loyal son? You canceled that yourselves with your choice. You chose Mark, you chose the house, and you chose the money over your own flesh and blood's ability to walk. But most importantly, you chose a definition of family that excludes my daughter. I pushed myself up from the table, my chair scraping harshly against the floor. I want you to listen carefully, because these are the last words you will hear from me. You are right. You have no financial obligation to Lily, and because she is not fully family to you, you are no longer family to me. The only real money in my life is the $160,000 Maria and I raised to save my daughter. You were judged and you failed. So, if we're being honest, Robert and Eleanor, you don't just own one house on Redwood Court. You also own the $1 million price tag on your souls. And tonight I am foreclosing on your status as grandparents. You are no longer relevant to my life. I'm taking my family, my full family, and we are leaving your legacy of lies and inequality behind. I didn't wait for the inevitable burst of shouting, tears, and defensive venom. The moment the final word was out, I turned and walked toward the front door. My father finally roared, "David, you come back here!" You can't speak to your mother and me that way. You owe us an explanation. I didn't slow down. No, I called back, my hand on the doorknob. I owe you nothing. I owe my daughter everything. My mother was sobbing Mark's name, a sound of manufactured devastation, but I could hear the undercurrent of furious, humiliated anger in it. Mark was yelling something unintelligible at my father. I had left behind not a resolution, but a total nuclear implosion of every carefully constructed lie they had lived for decades. I stepped out of the house and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me. The sound was not a slam, but a quiet, heavy thud, the sound of a vault door closing forever. The cool night air of October hit my face. I stood on the porch for a moment, listening to the muffled, chaotic shouting from inside, and then I walked to my car. When I slid into the driver's seat, I leaned back and closed my eyes, taking the first truly unburdened breath I'd had in 2 years. It was a victory, but it was not a happy one. It was a liberation bought with the currency of profound, irreplaceable sadness. I had successfully excised the poison, but I had lost a limb in the process. I started the engine and drove away from the driveway that had once felt like home. When I got back to my real home, Maria was waiting up, a book lying face down on her lap. She looked up at me, her eyes asking the question I hadn't had to answer. I walked over to the sofa, sat beside her, and simply placed my hand over hers. "It's over," I whispered. I told them everything. I walked out. She didn't ask for details, didn't ask what they said. She just squeezed my hand, a look of profound, exhausted relief washing over her face. "Thank you," she murmured, "for protecting us. Always," I said. Later, I walked down the hall to Lily's room. She was asleep, curled on her side, a stuffed unicorn clutched to her chest. Her feet, now perfectly aligned thanks to the expensive, life-altering surgery, were peeking out from under the blanket. I sat on the edge of her bed, watching the soft rise and fall of her chest. She was everything, my full family, the one I chose, the one I fight for, the one that is defined not by DNA or arbitrary decrees of blood, but by sacrifice, devotion, and unconditional love. I leaned down and kissed her forehead. The choice I had made felt heavy, but perfectly, finally right. I had walked away from the people who raised me, but I had walked toward the peace of knowing my daughter would never again be subject to a love that came with a price tag and a parenthetical disclaimer. The family was shattered, yes, but only the broken, poisoned half. The half that mattered, the one I sat beside, was finally whole.